Okay, everyone, welcome to the final University of Texas Energy Symposium of the fall 2021 semester. And to introduce today's panel, which is a panel discussion on energy justice and international development, I'm going to quickly transfer it to our moderator, Dr. Varun Rai, who's professor at LBJ School of Public Affairs and, of course, former director of the Energy Institute here, who sponsors the Energy Symposium. So, Varun, please go ahead and introduce the panel and go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kerry, and welcome everyone to a panel discussion on energy justice and international development. We couldn't have identified and chosen a better topic to conclude this semester's symposium than this topic. Such an important set of conversations that are going on, and with the recently concluded international discussions negotiations just a few weeks ago. This is very timely, and we will have opportunity to learn from our speakers. So we have three great speakers today in our panel. Mr. Ashwin Dayal, who is Senior Vice President for Power and Climate at the Rockefeller Foundation. Dr. Rebecca Shirley, who is Director of Research, Data and Innovation with the World Resources Institute in Africa. And Dana Harmon, who is Executive Director of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute based here in Austin. I'll very quickly just set the stage up by saying that energy justice, energy poverty, this is such a central aspect of the ongoing energy transition. In many ways, it is totally fair to say that if we do not take the opportunity of the ongoing transition to fundamentally alter the fabric of energy poverty and energy justice, then we would have failed no matter how we actually go across through the energy transition. There are hundreds of millions still in the world, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but then also spread across South Asia, Southeast Asia, that do not have access to electricity. But as we have learned over the last couple decades, that this is not just a problem concentrated in some parts of the world. Even in wealthier nations, the aspects of inequities in access, aspects of lack of infrastructure, access of lack of affordability really is pretty widespread and has huge long-term implications that really perpetuates along generations. And so we have a whole range of things to think about, discuss, and talk, and also inform that very importantly by what we have learned from the international discussion that just concluded. So with that, I would like to welcome you all and say that along any point in the discussion, if you have any questions, please feel free to type that into the Q&A box. The way we'll go with the conversation is I'll invite each of the panelists, starting with Ashwin, then Rebecca, and then Dana, to offer us some initial remarks, 5 minutes or so, and then we'll launch into 2 rounds of quick back and forth discussion that I will moderate, and then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for discussions with the audience. So with that, let me invite you, Ashwin, to open with your remarks.
Thanks, thanks, Varun, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm in New York, so I don't know what time zones others are in. I think Rebecca, you're in Nairobi, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you. And it's great to be part of a discussion on energy justice so soon after the COP meeting, which I was at, and I'm sure many of you were as well. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. We hear about just energy transitions, we talk about energy justice, and I just want to offer a few remarks in terms of how I look at this issue personally and how we as a foundation are trying to address it. And I sort of start with a couple of basic premises, our beliefs. The first being that we simply won't end poverty in the world without ending energy poverty. The second is we will not meaningfully address the climate crisis without ending energy poverty. So if we talk about net zero in 2050, we have to first talk about universal access in 2030. And I don't mean it's sequential, but we need to talk about them alongside. And I think that was one of the probably most interesting conversations that came out of COP26 was I, for the first time, saw a much closer coming together of these separate issues, SDG 7 and SDG 13, and all of these really being part of one conversation around energy justice and just energy transitions. So we as a foundation have been learning over the years about how we can do more in this area, actually starting very much with a focus on energy access and looking at how to, billions of people consume not less, but actually more energy in order to improve their lives and their livelihoods. And the fact is that, efforts to protect the planet have largely excluded the energy needs and economic aspirations of billions of people in the developing and emerging world. And developing and emerging countries have prioritized their growth at the expense of some sense of this shared climate future, and understandably. But we're at a different moment now, where I think for the first time in history, the frontiers of energy technology mean that we can dramatically expand access to renewable energy that will transform those lives and livelihoods of billions of people, but we can do it in a way that protects the planet from the worst impacts of climate change. And that's what's so exciting. And I think that's what the sort of theme of COP26 for us was all about. To take this forward, we have recently, in partnership with a set of other amazing organizations, launched something called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. And its goal really is to sort of accelerate an inclusive energy transition and to see that as an on-ramp for human opportunity. And what do we mean by that? We're talking about expanding access, that no person on this planet in the 21st century should be living unconnected from a modern grid, which can power their lives and power their livelihoods. At the same time, reducing carbon emissions, we need to do that. And so if you think about the low energy consumers of today, who are going to be the high energy consumers of tomorrow, let's look at the best available options to address that issue in a sort of low carbon way. And then finally, economic growth. I mean, this is a catalyst for economic development, not just as consumers of energy who can then apply it in their businesses, but the energy supply chain itself as potentially a creator of jobs and tens of millions of jobs, if indeed we're to electrify 800 million people and frankly 2.5 billion people who still suffer from unreliable or insufficient access to energy. So whether we're talking about distributed renewables or grid-based renewables, or even sort of transitioning from larger fossil fuels, there's a huge amount of work to be done across the developing and emerging world. And that's what the Alliance has come together to try and do. Try and get head of state commitments, try and get different stakeholders in a country to work together, identify and source the real opportunities for sort of transformational projects and programs that can take the transition and the access issue together, provide the kind of flexible technical support that's needed. We often hear about not enough projects out there, not enough money out there. Well, which one is it? And the truth is it's a mismatch between the two. There's a huge need for grant capital and flexible capital to come in and support the development of viable, scalable solutions on renewable energy, distributed renewables, et cetera, in the emerging world and in the developing world. So what the foundation did last year, alongside a couple of other major philanthropies, with IKEA Foundation and the Bezos Earth Fund, is we put together an initial package of $1.5 billion of grant money to really help accelerate this process, work with as many countries as we can to develop transformational projects, but very importantly then bring in a network of additional investment and delivery partners, because even $1.5 billion or $2 billion of grant capital, frankly, you can spend it very quickly in the energy sector unless you've got a stack of capital sitting above that. So if we're smart, we'll use this capital to incentivize others to come into the sector, to make sure that power is provided not just urgently and quickly, but also affordably for low-income communities in the developing world. And we think it can unlock at least $100 billion of investments of public and private capital working together. So we're excited to be moving this process forward on a much larger scale. I think it epitomizes what we mean by energy justice and a sort of a just energy transition. We're working with an incredible range of partners on the technical side, organizations like SC Sustainable Energy for All and IRENA and Power Africa, and many of them I'm sure you've heard of, and then investors like the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and so on and so forth. The question is, how do we break the business as usual challenge that we face, get this alliance working together, link up that precious flexible money with the larger pools of capital that are out there, work with governments to kind of address their needs, and then truly see what a just energy transition can be, what it can look like, what it can feel like for rural farmers in Malawi, or people living in unelectrified cities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or even people who are grid connected in Eastern India, but who, get 6 hours of outages every day and therefore can't really rely on it to run their businesses. And that's ultimately what this is about. It's about people's lives, people's livelihoods. So it's great to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Varun and team, for inviting me. And I'll pause there and I look forward to hearing from the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashwin. If I could ask you a very quick follow-up. You mentioned $1.5 billion funds, and the main idea there being to catalyze certain things and eventually, hopefully, leverage around $100 billion in additional capital and set the whole flowing thing in motion. Can you give an example, either real or something that you all have envisioned of a project or a set of activities that would actually lead to additional capital? On top of what you all might catalyze initially through a grant?
Yeah, no, I can give you a few, but let me one I've been talking about a lot recently because I'm just excited about it is work in DRC, in Democratic Republic of Congo, that I mentioned. So the last 5 or 6 years, a group of very committed organizations, including CDC GridWorks and PIDGE and a few others, have been trying to develop this idea of metro grids, right? These larger scale distributed renewable, largely solar-based energy systems. But it took them 6 years to get the first 3 projects just to the tender and bidding process, which happened this quarter or last quarter. And they'll break ground in early 2022. Each one of these towns is about 150 to 170,000 people. These are not dense, super densely populated towns. These are, you could almost think of them as very large villages, right? With a mixture of low-rise, some 2-3 story buildings, very diverse economic activity. Now, there are 50 cities in DRC that are more than 15 kilometers from the single transmission line that runs along the south of the country. So the question is, how do you take those 3 city projects, everything we've learned from it, and then turbocharge a process to get 20, 25, 30 cities? It'll take about $150 million of grant capital, but it'll also take about $850 million of investment capital. So we're starting the process now with government involvement and with the development finance institutions that are interested in this sector and in this country to say, okay, if we were to take the risk on the project development side, and we were to take some of the first loss risk on the investment side, would you be willing to actually develop these 25 city projects simultaneously rather than sequentially? And if we fail, then we've taken the loss. And I think that's the best use of philanthropic capital, frankly, in this sector, is the willingness to take that risk. I mean, you have to be intelligent risk taking. You can't just throw money at a project that's not got any chance. But that's one that I'm really excited about. We're just getting going on the sort of scale up process. We invested in those first 3 projects, so there's a lot of learning from that. And there are countless examples like that, Varun, around the world of things that can be done if you can just get enough collaboration going and have, frankly, enough concessional capital available and willing to be used in that way.
Great. That's very insightful, Ashwin. Thank you so much. We'll come back to you with more questions. Rebecca, over to you for your initial remarks.
Thanks, Varun, to you and your team for organizing this discussion. Hi, everyone who's tuning in, and good evening, good morning. My name is Rebecca Shirley. I direct research for Africa at the World Resources Institute, which is an independent research institute working at the intersection of global environmental and developmental challenges. We've been working across the world from Latin America to Africa, India, China, Indonesia, and the Pacific, also the US and Europe over the past some 40 years. Our activities are focused on 7 key areas of work. Those are food, forests, water, energy, cities, oceans, and of course, climate. And our actual activities they're threefold. They involve delivering fundamental flagship research, like our World Resources reports that some of you might be familiar with. We also launch and host public access data platforms like the Global Forest Watch, Climate Watch, and the upcoming Land and Carbon Watch, and of course our well-known Energy Access Explorer. And then third, we also work with partners to convene and host and run global coalitions, which many of you might have heard of before, like the Coalition for Urban Transition, or the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the NDC Partnership, and so on. So Ashwin gave some really fantastic comments on the COP and what we saw coming out of that. So I don't want to repeat that too much, but Varun, allow me perhaps to just take one step backwards and provide some framework remarks to help unpack what we even mean by this concept of just transition for your audience as we move forward with today's discussion. Of course, I think for this audience that's probably very keen on climate and energy, no need to say that the latest science from the IPCC has already made quite clear that the climate change situation is now an emergency which demands both rapid and far-reaching global action. So we're seeing some shrinking carbon budgets that require two things: both deep and immediate decarbonization in developed economies, and then swift action to ensure sustainable low-carbon development pathways in emerging economies. Now, at the same time as we know that, we also know that the climate crisis is embedded within a global context of historic, systemic, and growing inequality, which perpetuates deep poverty, resource and labor exploitation, unemployment, unfair distribution of the burden of pollution and emissions, and ultimately heightened social and economic vulnerability to the very climate impacts that we're trying to mitigate. So out of that contradiction of both what we need to solve climate and the global context that the challenge is embedded in, out of that contradiction, we've seen many local movements emerge to advocate that a fair economy and a low carbon environment can and must coexist. In fact, these movements tend to argue that if the process of transitioning to low carbon economies is not just, then the outcomes cannot be sustainable. And these movements aim to build economic and political power from the bottom up to embed the shift from extractive to sustainable economies with principles of fair participation, fair distribution, fair compensation, in other words, to leave no one behind. So the Just Transitions movement, that's sort of, we know how it evolved, and it's highly relevant to the Africa context. Let me just say a little bit about why, and then of course in the following conversation we can dig into some of this. Just remember that the Just Transitions principles were actually first developed by global trade unions in the 1980s to promote development of new energy industries in a way that secured workers' rights and accounted for negative effects on communities and livelihoods. And since then, the movement has been heavily influenced by, of course, the labor movement, the environmental justice movement, and the climate justice movement. And based on that deep connectivity and that co-evolution of these movements over time, a concept has evolved that takes on now a broader definition than just jobs. And some think about the Just Transition definition as the set of principles, the set of strategies and practices that are required to transition workers and their surrounding communities into thriving economies that provide dignified, productive, ecologically sustainable livelihoods, and participatory and democratic governance and ecological resilience. And out of that definition and sort of the growing interconnectedness of our global conversation, you've seen three branches start to emerge. There's the Just Urban Transition stream, the Just Rural Transition stream, and what we're here to discuss today, the Just Energy Transitions stream. And Just Energy Transitions really specifically focuses on energy sectors, both upstream and downstream, to secure workers' rights and provide social protection for affected workers and their communities, and to help remove barriers for integrating fossil fuel workers into our clean energy sectors, and to build necessary workforce capacity to deliver on clean energy goals. And it's often expanded, as Ashwin was mentioning, to include delivering universal, reliable, affordable energy access to everyone. So I say all of that just because I think it's important context to understand what we mean when we talk about just transitions and just energy transitions in particular. These are very, very powerful movements right now in Africa. Given our focus tonight is on energy, I'll just say, maybe just a little bit more on the just energy transitions. Why is this so important in Africa? Well, if you think about it, Africa's role in the global energy transition is undeniable for a number of reasons, both as a major source of the minerals and precious metals that are essential to the green energy and green technology transition, but also, as Ashwin mentioned, as the least electrified yet fastest growing continent on the globe, and one of the regions in the world most crucially in need of investment in resiliency infrastructure, given its climate vulnerability. And because of how those multiple issues are compounding in real time, if we don't act soon, and Ashwin gave some great examples of what action could look like, and if we don't do those things, by 2050, we'll have Africa being the Earth's most populous continent, housing over 80% of its poor, 90% of those left without basic energy access, its most vulnerable populations to climate change, all while having contributed less than 5% of global emissions. So when you frame it in that context, you start to see, this is what we mean by just energy transitions and why African energy transitions and resilience becomes an urgent global justice and equity challenge that you should care about, no matter where in the world you're tuning in from. And in a vacuum of alignment and data and evidence on what just transition pathways look like for Africa, there is a real risk of assigning to Africa what her options are and imposing a singular pathway of what the just energy transition looks like. So I'll pause there, and I think maybe in the Q&A I can say a bit more about, what is the role that academia and the nonprofit research space can play in this just energy transitions dialogue, and how we move from here to develop more informed perspectives and positions, both for the continent and for its allies. So thanks, Varun, for the opportunity to offer these remarks and to be part of this brilliant conversation, and I'll keep it there.
Great, thank you so much for that framework and that perspective, Rebecca. It's always great to remind ourselves where this all started, how it all is evolving, but why are we even talking about this? Let me ask you a very quick follow-up. When we talk about energy justice, poverty, we tend to, even I use that in my opening remark, there are hundreds of millions of people. Is this a uniform problem, right? Can we say, Africa is dealing with this? Or as you do your work, Rebecca, across countries, across continents, are you seeing major dimensions of this problem that are fundamentally different from each other within the larger rubric of energy poverty and justice?
That's a brilliant question, and it's not uniformed across the board. I think we're seeing, and Ashwin mentioned some of these numbers in his talk, and you did it also in the introduction, that we're sort of seeing now that by 2050, even by 2030, actually, the energy access and energy poverty challenge is going to be largely an African challenge to solve. Of the 750 million, that number coming down a little bit, that will be left without access by 2030, 90% of those persons, so 9 in 10, are here on the continent. So definitely you're seeing some striation. And why is that? Well, I think we can look at the historical context from which sub-Saharan African power utilities have emerged, which actually puts before them a very different set of circumstances and challenges in achieving universal energy access and energy sector growth than their advanced energy market counterparts had. So we see African utilities are generally capital and usually cash constrained. They have very low demand bases, many users oftentimes unable to afford even a connection, far less the power that comes from that connection. Consumption levels tend to be quite small and grow very slowly, if at all. So that all makes cost recovery very difficult, and investment can sometimes be unprofitable. And so institutions tend to be, weaker. And in some cases, of course, we have challenges around fiscal governance. So we see that a number of challenges sort of allow the utility to lag behind their wealthier counterparts in almost every possible way in terms of energy access, from reliability to environmental standards and affordability. And those are some of the challenges that we need to kind of figure out how to address for a just energy transition for Africa.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. We'll be back to you with more questions. Next, I would like to turn to Dana Harmon to bring it home, right here in the US, in Texas, in Austin. Dana.
Thank you, Varun. What an honor to be here with such esteemed colleagues. And thank you to the Energy Institute for having me, and to Varun and your team for organizing this incredibly important and timely discussion. My name is Dana Harmon, and I have the privilege of leading the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. I'm also a proud fellow of UTES Energy Institute under Dr. Rye's leadership. TEPRI is an impact-driven research organization based here in Austin, Texas, with a focus on advancing domestic energy equity and addressing energy poverty here in Texas. While I appreciate most of this conversation is focused on the developing world, and rightfully so, we believe that lessons that we're learning here in Texas may have applications nationally and internationally, and vice versa. We have a lot to learn from progress in other parts of the world. We have a tremendous opportunity right now to work together and learn from each other. And also, as Ashvin mentioned earlier so eloquently, this work ultimately is about people's lives and people's livelihoods. Here at TEPRI, our theory of change is based on linking community voices here locally in our communities with science and data and innovative partnerships to advance community-driven economic development and enhance community well-being through energy. Since 2016, our organization has studied insecurity here in Texas. When we refer to energy insecurity, we mean an inability to adequately meet basic household energy needs. We focus on people and communities who are vulnerable to energy insecurity and collect information about lived experiences here in Texas. Those manifest themselves as disproportionate energy cost burdens, trade-offs to pay utility bills, such as trading off for food or clothing, discomfort and stress related to energy access and affordability, and importantly, impacts on health. Because energy consumption is highly dependent on buildings, we study housing and opportunities for weatherization and energy efficiency and energy technology deployment. We're actively working on opportunities for distributed energy resources, including community solar and storage, to address high energy cost burdens and increase community resilience here in Texas. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and cascading events of the past couple of years have certainly compounded the struggle. In a recent national survey, more than a quarter of people here in the US who lost their jobs during the pandemic reported needing to skipping a utility bill payment. Last October, we ran a survey to find out how people who self-identified as financially strained have been affected by the pandemic from an energy perspective. And we see a definite trend in unaffordable electric bills among communities of color, with 49% of respondents who identified as Hispanic and 40% who identified as Black saying they're struggling to pay their electricity bills. We see here in this data opportunity to advance a more just and equitable energy future through investments in energy efficiency, investments in weatherization, and renewable energy technologies, specifically targeting the benefits of that technology deployment towards underserved populations. So our organization is focused on the research and solution development that can scale here on the ground in Texas. We're also working to advance more equitable participation in the clean energy economy through workforce development, as was mentioned earlier. We see immense opportunity for family-sustaining jobs, and proud to be working with colleagues in Houston, Detroit, and Minneapolis on a National Science Foundation-funded initiative focused on broadening participation in STEM-focused clean energy education. I appreciate that our work towards energy justice is different in many regards to that of my fellow panelists, but I believe that we have the common overarching objective of the UN Sustainable Development Goal 7, which is affordable and clean energy access for all. I know that we have a lot to talk about, so I'll pause there, but I look forward to the continued discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. A very quick follow-up for you. In Texas, we also had an extreme experience earlier this year with the February winter storms when we had blackouts. Your response could be specific to that event, but maybe speak broadly if you want to. What happens in the context of the problem that you just laid before us when we have extreme events like that, experiences like that? What types of additional burdens or complications does it mean for poor sections of the society?
It's a great question, Varun, and certainly a relevant one, still on the minds of many people here in Texas. That winter storm that we experienced last February, Winter Storm Uri, certainly exposed vulnerabilities in our energy system that many of us considered unimaginable at the time. And many of us, along with our loved ones, experienced firsthand what energy insecurity feels like. But it's incredibly important for us to understand that while we all may have experienced the storm, it affected us all, but didn't affect us all equally. People without access to resources have a harder time weathering outages like we experienced in February. And we've got to find ways to address the disproportionate social impacts in our energy systems planning. The data shows that in addition to going without heat and water during the storm itself, implications included lost wages, lost food, property damage, and other implications that were more highly experienced by low-income communities in our state, but then by their higher income counterparts. So being prepared for extreme weather events like we experienced last February matters.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. Also, while we have you, I'll come. My next question will be for Ashwin, but before we do that, there's a question on something that you said, which is, can you speak a little bit more on the clean energy education project that you're working with your colleagues across the country?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is a National Science Foundation funded initiative as part of their Includes initiative focused on broadening participation in STEM education. And we are specifically focused on broadening participation in clean energy workforce development through STEM. So we're focused on high school students and looking for ways to expose more students to clean energy jobs, including the training required for solar energy efficiency and weatherization to broaden participation in the future clean energy workforce. This initiative is part of a planning grant at this phase, but we're looking forward to launching a broader nationwide initiative in the coming years.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. And Dana in the audience who asked this question, please feel free to reach out to Dana Harmon, the panelist. I'm sure she'll be happy to share more with you. Let me turn to Ashwin. And I'll remind the audience, please keep typing in your questions in the Q&A box. This is going to be exciting. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time, but let's keep this conversation going. Ashwin, turning to you, let's talk about institutions. Something that you mentioned, the Energy Alliance that just was announced and is starting to do really important work. As you look over the fabric of this issue over the last 2-3 decades, what would you say have been the biggest institutional innovations? Or to flip the question in a different way, do you still think that there are still major institutional bottlenecks that need to be overcome for us to address this issue at scale and fundamentally in a way that that resolves this fact? So that's part A, and part B of the question is a little bit more specific, and that has to do a very important aspect of your work and that of everybody else is working with governments. Those could be local governments, those could be national governments, and something that goes hand in hand is lack of institutional capacity, aspects and issues with governance. And so when you go and try to develop projects or collaboration with different stakeholders, including governments, what type of preparation do you have to do? What are you looking for? And if those are missing, what I heard you say is you all are not running away, rather taking the time, effort, thought, and putting in the resources to basically overcome those as well. So give us a little bit as to what does it actually mean in terms of working and developing these partnerships. So 2 separate questions. One is the longer institutional arc and innovations that have happened or missing, and how do you work with governments?
Those are both huge questions. I was once chatting to someone who you might know, Praveer Sinha, who's the CEO of Tata Power.
I know him.
They're talking about institutional innovation within the energy sector, and even in the private sector, he was saying, there's a real lack of innovation, or there's historically been a lack of innovation in the sort of electricity utility space. And that was sort of interesting to hear coming from the CEO of a large private corporation who was also struggling to kind of push some new thinking in what is the role of a utility and what is the future of a utility in particularly in a developing country context. Look, I mean, I think there are two things can be true at the same time. On the one hand, no country in the world has achieved universal access without a very significant public sector role. And so public sector institutions that have either just innovated or frankly just been really well funded to scale up electrification, whether if you look at the stories of China and Vietnam or even the US and 100 years ago, it took massive public-private, but massive public investment, and then in order to draw in and attract the private sector. So I think the biggest innovations have been where you've seen a recognition of the need for state sector or public sector financing and public policy to be at the heart of saying this is a challenge that actually the market on its own is not going to solve. It actually will need major public sector innovation. Whether it's looking at, we talk about distributed renewable electrification today as though distributed electrification is a new concept. It's actually not. It's just the renewable side is new. But in many parts of the world, actually, there were local mini grids, if you like, that were diesel run or other fuel sources that were actually built around anchors of demand, industrial zones, new economic development areas, large cities or large villages, etc. So I think there's been a whole swathe of innovation there. Somewhere along the way, a very singular model of how electrification in a developing nation seemed to take hold. And I can't quite put my finger on why that happened and when exactly that happened. But the idea that a grid can only be built from the inside out, that you start at the center and eventually you get to the periphery, and that it'll take 10 or 15 or 20 years or 25 years, and that's just how it has to be. And I think, honestly, I'm a development economist. I'm not even an energy expert. And I think part of the issue is a lack of appreciation or a change in the role of energy in economic development that has changed the sense of urgency around how we solve these problems. So the innovations we're seeing now are much more about building the grid from the outside in, networked grids, and this is as much in the developed world with the new ways of consumers and businesses communicating with each other, but certainly in the developing world where grids have not reached everywhere, the introduction of new technologies that are more affordable and new business models that are allowing people to innovate, and then government still playing a key role in regulating for that, because the big threat that any mini grid operator has in sub-Saharan Africa or in India or anywhere else is what happens if the grid arrives. So do you have effective public policy and regulation around that? So we've seen an explosion of innovation. I think over the last 5-10 years, you've seen an emergence of a whole set of companies that are working in partnership with governments, with utilities, with regulators. In Nigeria, you're seeing large utilities now try distribution franchising models with DRE companies. You're seeing even in India, I mentioned Praveer earlier, they now control a very significant part of the Odisha network, and are looking at how they can incorporate a DRE to strengthen for grid stabilization as well as improving reliability of service in parts of Odisha. That's really exciting. So you're still seeing, I think you're seeing technology has allowed a sort of a fresh wave of innovation, I think, in terms of business models of larger utilities as well as smaller ones. And just on your last question on government capacity, yeah, I mean, look, this is the hardest area, right? I mean, it took 4 or 5 years, even in a place like India, to get a mini grid policy going in somewhere like Uttar Pradesh and UP in North India. Nigeria took 9 years to build the capacity they needed for REA, the Rural Electrification Agency, to finally land the massive investments they got from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. So we have to invest in that upstream capacity. You can't walk away. You need to take a long-term view. We're not going to get quick fixes everywhere, and that's again why public financing and grant funding from philanthropies can be really important, because we're willing to invest in that enabling environment, that capacity side in places where If we don't do that, the projects are simply not going to flow, because the people who are making the more hard-nosed investment decisions are going to look at that enabling environment and say, like, there's no way. So it's absolutely central to the approach, and we've just got to stick with it. If you can find champions within government, if you can find sort of centers of innovation within government, and work with those leaders, those individuals, those agents actually of change, often who are sitting in a utility or sitting in a Ministry of Energy, you find these people, you work with them, you support them, and that's how you start to see things move.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashwin. And I'll remind the audience to keep typing in your questions in the Q&A box. Rebecca, let me turn to you next. You work on research, innovation, and data. And while we're on the topic of innovation and change, give us some examples of how data might be helping us understand and characterize the problems better and providing insights into potential solutions.
Thanks, Varun, and I like your phrasing of framing the problems. To bring it back to the Africa context, as we mentioned sort of at the beginning of the talk, we could start to see why what some of these energy transitions challenges are and why they are so important. I think we saw coming out of COP a number of really fantastic pledges for energy transition, both in power generation and in industry. The Global Energy Alliance for People in Partnership is one of many. And of course, we saw some really great commitments around net zero and phasing out coal and so on. And so those are great, but today we actually have very few clear regional or Pan-African positions on some very key energy transitions issues, such as how to deal with near-term coal investment opportunities, or the role of transition fuels like natural gas, or what are the implications for this transition for hydrocarbon export-dependent economies, and how do we think about the challenges of job displacement? How do we think about the competing finance needs between adaptation and delivery of energy access and clean cooking alternatives? And so there's many sort of questions that are still unanswered, or not that they're unanswered, but we don't have really strong perspectives and consensus around. And in that vacuum of alignment, and in that vacuum of data and evidence, that's where that's where challenges can crop up. And so rather than, as I mentioned earlier on, assigning to Africa what this transition would look like, with the data and nonprofit research space and the academic space could really step in, is helping to co-create ambitious visions of African energy futures that can foster informed perspectives and informed positions for the continent. And so I see this as a pretty pivotal time, actually, for research and data. And working with WRI is an institution that sort of tries to put energy research into the forefront. We really believe this is a pivotal time for deeply exploring African energy futures and pathways. And that urgency, the urgency of that task is really underlined by the real-time ongoing prospects of carbon lock-in. Just as examples, there are existing plans in Eastern and Southern Africa and countries right now that include more than 100 gigawatts of new coal-fired power plants that would be installed by 2040, the development of which would triple the continent's carbon dioxide emissions. So these are real-time challenges and real-time research and analytics that need to be applied to the dialogue. Another thing that I would say in terms of where research could step in, Varun, is just on this issue of just transitions. I think that African activists and African youth groups and trade unions and civil society are deeply engaged in raising much needed awareness on these topics of just transitions. And they're really good at identifying the challenges. We know it's easier to identify what is not just and what is just, and to define what a just transition actually does look like. And the vision varies by region, it varies by country, it varies by group. And so there are many gaps that remain around interpreting these concepts for the African context. Let me just give you 2 or 3 examples. We still don't have a consensus around what does it mean programmatically and politically to develop and implement a just transitions agenda. in, for instance, Africa's hydrocarbon or agriculture or mining dependent economies? How do we actually pursue and recognize and monitor and measure what just means in the Africa context? How do we account for variations across cities in developing evaluation frameworks? How do we marry local perceptions and definitions with donor-driven perceptions and definitions of just transition? So these are some of the spaces, again, where both the analytical sciences as well as the social sciences really have an important role to play from a data and academics point of view in helping to nuance the just transitions conversation.
That's very insightful, Rebecca. Before I turn to Dana, Ashwin, Rebecca, I'll draw your attention to two questions, which I'll come back to after I pose a question to Dana. One is on hydropower, the other one is on extractive mining. And so please take a look, and then I'll be back to you. Dana, question for you. At the beginning of 21, Texas entered as the 9th largest economy by GDP globally. And yet we heard from you that energy poverty is pretty pervasive and has been quite sustained here in Texas. Why do we have such a rich, wealthy, global leader in energy from any angle you talk about? Why do we have this issue? What is keeping it alive, this issue, and what are some of the things we need to do to address it here in Texas?
Thank you, Varun. It's a great question, and still to me personally quite shocking that we have the systemic disparities in our energy system that exist today in a developed country like the U.S. and in such a flourishing state, energy-driven state such as Texas. I'll echo some of Rebecca's comments related to the need for better data-driven decisions in terms of how we address those disparities. And I loved, Rebecca, your comments on bringing communities together to co-create ambitious visions for their energy futures. And I believe that we have the opportunity to do something very similar here in Texas. I'll give one example that's a relatively small example, but I think an important one that highlights some of the opportunities that are available. Over the course of the past 16 months or so, we have been facilitating a group called the Energy Opportunities Coalition here in Texas that was formed to pursue opportunities for collaboration among a very diverse group of stakeholders, from utilities to community-based organizations, environmental justice organizations, housing advocates, utility assistance providers, to really think about what opportunities do we see to support clean energy investments for underserved communities here in Texas? And how can we align on the objective of bringing the benefits of the clean energy transition to our traditionally underserved communities? The coalition aimed to identify really opportunities to leverage emerging technologies to mitigate energy poverty specifically, while reducing the emissions targets that we're setting for ourselves through our climate action planning goals across the various cities here in Texas. To that end, the coalition formed 3 key advisory groups that I'd like to talk a bit about, which I think goes back to the intersectionality of really energy and its pivotal position with key points of our society. Those 3 advisory groups were housing and distributed energy resources, looking at opportunities for mobility and the energy transition related to electrification of transportation, and importantly, the intersection of energy and health. Now, those 3 topics, of course, are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I think one of the things that we found with our advisory groups was there was lots of overlaps between each of those topics. But the goal was to develop actionable recommendations in each of those 3 areas that can really begin to both identify community needs and hone in on solutions that can begin to address energy poverty as it's experienced here in Texas. I'll give a high-level overview of the recommendations for each of those advisory topics, and this is a paper that we've published recently that's available on our website as well for those who may want to learn more. For housing and DER's recommendations included forming a network of community organizations across Texas to ensure greater community engagement in energy systems planning decisions and support and involvement in the solutions development process. Our coalition recognized that included providing both community data-driven needs assessments and analysis, as well as technical assistance and compensation for participation, and ideally ways to leverage additional funding sources that are available. We also saw the opportunity to systematically explore historical and current energy efficiency and retrofit programs. We recognize that our housing stock here in Texas is aging, and there is tremendous opportunity in our buildings to develop new solutions that can also ensure greater community involvement and increase program participation, including developing pilot programs to demonstrate and evaluate those recommendations. On the mobility front, we recognize that there's still a lot to be learned in terms of the energy transition on the mobility side. And the coalition identified a need for a Texas-specific investigation of transportation burdens that are experienced both in our urban and rural communities across the state, using existing resources, but really that would include a lot more data collection. Primary research is needed in this space. This would be analogous to a lot of the work that's been done on residential energy burdens, but really looking at transportation burden as part of the complete energy picture. The coalition recommended developing an EV transition roadmap, really specifically targeting low to moderate income communities and accessibility to those technologies. And that roadmap would outline important research questions and policy recommendations and key decision points to guide the allocation of resources to encourage a more equitable transportation energy transition. And then finally, I mentioned on the energy and health side, energy and health recommendations included developing a set of standards to really effectively leverage those two sectors and measure the health benefits associated with energy efficiency improvements in residential buildings. And really that is a vital step to fully integrate and leverage the resources of those two disciplines. We see a real opportunity for expanded knowledge and cross-sector collaboration between the home environmental health and energy efficiency improvements, an opportunity to develop and form more relationships between the utility sector, energy sector, and federally qualified health centers at that intersection of energy and health. This is only a start of the coalition, but we believe that convenings like these, stakeholder engagement opportunities like these, provide an important framework to support clean energy opportunities for investments in underserved communities here in Texas.
Thank you, Dana. Those are very rounded and holistic and take a much broader view, which is what we also heard from the other panelists, is we need to take a longer term holistic view and not deal with this in a piecemeal. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible to address these. I'll turn quickly to Ashwin and Rebecca. I have two sets of questions, both from the audience, and I think both of you will have insights into this. The first one is on hydropower. What are your views on the role of hydropower, and also the role climate change might actually play given increasing droughts and so on?
Ashwin, do you want to, or shall I go ahead?
Please go ahead.
I think this is actually a brilliant question from the audience. Hydropower is a big part of especially the East African generation mix for Africa. And actually we have, in Kenya, for instance, we've got a significant amount of our generation is coming from already fairly green sources like depending on how you classify hydropower, but geothermal, solar, wind, etc. Uganda, Ethiopia, all very hydropower dependent. When you speak to the utilities and the IPPs that are operating here, we're seeing the fact that we have more extreme weather events, as the audience member was pointing out. We just had a drought this year, just sort of, we're coming out of it right now in Kenya, but last year was extreme floods. And so we're seeing more and more extreme weather events. When you talk to the utilities, they're aware that there are risks, but really struggle in terms of how to integrate that into their planning. Why? Well, because, it's how do we actually develop plans for true adaptive capacity in our generation mix at the level of the individual water basin when we have so little local data and local analysis and local projections to work with. As we all know, climate science is based on long-term objections, long-term observations of weather patterns, but there is very, very little up to standard climate observation infrastructure in Africa, and therefore there's very little that is known in terms of what is happening on the continent. So whereas, for instance, the IPCC is able to draw pretty confident conclusions about trends that we're likely to see in the EU or North America or Australia, there's a fat tail, a lot of uncertainty around the Africa findings. And so this is it's a really practical question that the audience member has raised. I think that the sector is aware of and really struggles with the data. Again, this kind of relates to where the research and data community can step in. We really do actually lack projections-oriented data to help us think about how to integrate those risks into the planning models.
Ashwin, would you like to add?
Look, I mean, Rebecca answered brilliantly on the hydropower and the climate issue. I would just add, there's a sort of, the question on hydropower made me think about there's an underlying political question and challenge for Africa and frankly for other regions as well. The big debate for many of these countries is, what is my base load energy source going to be? So it's not going to be coal. And anyway, coal is outside South Africa is a fairly negligible fuel source anyway for electricity generation in Africa. So your options are hydro, gas, natural gas, and maybe new nuclear. Each one of those comes with huge political, environmental, and social challenges. There's some enthusiasm around smaller hydro, right? Run of the river, 30, 40 megawatt scale plants versus the big, grand Renaissance Dam type projects. But leaving aside the climate change issue and the impact that has on hydro, it just in general, we're going to need a much more realistic and sophisticated understanding of the need of the energy mix that is going to be needed in Africa in order for there to be a genuine transition plan and real ownership over those transition plans. Frankly, if I can be I don't know if this is provocative or not, but frankly, the lecturing on gas and the positions on natural gas taken against some of the countries in Africa that have planned expanded capacity on natural gas. I mean, it's pretty hypocritical, frankly. So, taking the question beyond the climate change impact on hydro, there is an underlying question: is how are African nations going to fuel growth with the right mix of energy, knowing that pure renewables isn't 100% renewables is not viable right now, technically viable in most of these countries. There is some also interesting work to be done. I think the group at MIT is doing some of this work on regional power pools and how do you strengthen those in Africa as one part of the solution to kind of help with easing and smoothing out the energy mix challenges that any one particular country has. So the sort of geopolitical side of it, we haven't really touched on, but I would just throw that into the mix as something that we really there needs to be a process that's sort of really getting at that question. And that's often about trust and political relationships across regions, sub-regions, or entire regions. But it is also about a kind of a north-south kind of conversation that still is unfinished, I think, on the role of transition fuels in order to get to a better place in 2050 or wherever. I mean, Nigeria put out its net zero plan, I think, for 2060. And the first reaction was, well, that's sort of, that's not 2050. It was like, no, but it's a plan and it's something and it's a start. And India put out a 2070 plan. And again, there was like, so there's a real risk here around sort of alienating developing nations so much that they just back away from this question altogether. And we just can't afford that.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashwin. We are about at the end of the allotted time we have, and there are still a couple of really, really good questions from the audience. But what I want to do is wrap this up by asking each one of you to share what makes you hopeful. If you look down the road 30 years, and as we try to address the climate change issue and go through the transition, what gives you hope in simultaneously addressing energy poverty in a very systemic, fundamental way? And I want to end the panel on a positive note. So, let me, whosoever wants to go first.
Varun, maybe I'll start if that's okay. And I'll say, one of the things that makes me hopeful, frankly, is conversations like this one and the frequency of conversations like this one. When TEPRI started 6 years ago, the concept of energy poverty here in Texas was not known, was not a common conversation, was not something that we were talking about, much less talking about energy poverty, addressing energy poverty in the context of a just energy transition. I believe what makes me hopeful now is listening to the remarks of my fellow panelists here, and the good work that's coming out of COP and other events, and really thinking about how much focus there is on this transition and the recognition that we must address both simultaneously. It's not one or the other. And I know here, on the ground in Texas, I feel like our organization has felt that shift, that sea change. Of course, there's a lot of work to do, but the momentum is building, and I believe that it will continue. And so I'm hopeful for the future.
Thank you, Dana.
Well, I can go next. That was great, Dana. So firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge there were so many great questions in the chat, and that kind of made me hopeful as well. There's from comments about corruption and to what's the situation in Lebanon, to there was a comment in the chat about just the whole failure on financing. So it seems like there's a cohort of people around the world that UT and others are galvanizing to really think more deeply around what does energy justice really mean in the developed world, in the emerging world, and depend whether you're low income, high income, whatever. So I just wanted to play that back to this group. I am also hopeful about the converging of the agendas. To build a little bit on what Dana said, I mean, I think I don't want to be at COP32 or whatever, still trying to find a deal. But I think the fact that there is a genuine coming together of the conversation on energy access, energy transition, that there is now some leadership being shown from large developing nations to play a role in the energy transition conversation, but on their terms. I think that will be has the potential to really move us forward in a very positive way. The other thing I'll just say is people's aspirations are changing dramatically. People understand energy in a way that they didn't before. They understand the centrality of it to their lives. So there's going to be a massive demand for change in a way that perhaps wasn't there 15, 20, 25 years ago. So that makes me hopeful too.
Thank you, Ashwin. Rebecca, you have the last word.
Gosh, I wish I got to go before Ashwin. He stole the words right out of my mouth in terms of what's making me hopeful. But I completely agree that we are starting to see the conversations come together. This is no fault of the SDGs, but that sort of 1 through 14 rubric kind of puts us into silos of thinking, right, around energy access and water and health and so on. And what you're starting to see, I think, with these conversations is a convergence. We're seeing the linkages so clearly now between energy access and transitions, and some of the, the fossil fuels and transition fuels issues that Ashwin brought up. We're seeing those linked to issues around circular economy and e-waste, and some of the questions in the chat around mining. That is linking now into conversations around jobs and labor laws and labor exploitation. And that links then into equity and inequality and historic responsibilities, which then links into climate, climate targets and climate commitments. And so the whole conversation, I think, we're starting to see those intersectionalities in ways that perhaps we were sort of working in silos before. And so I think that means that even if the progress is slow moving, the fact that these are becoming more mainstreamed conversations where you have the general public involved, and having opinions and points of view and perspective and being able to put pressure on, I think that makes me quite hopeful. And then also, of course, what makes me hopeful, and I have to say this as someone working within the research spaces, there are many, many unsung heroes that are doing brilliant work, developing the technologies, not just of today, but of 2030, 2040, 2050, doing the work that has to be done now, so that in the future these are commercial solutions. And so there's just, when you think about what's happening across the technology space, it's brilliant to see. And I think that sectors like the energy access sector are becoming quite sophisticated on things like the afterlife of technologies and circular economy and the sustainability of materials and so on. So that also really makes me hopeful, is that we are developing solutions to address some of these very hairy topics.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much, Rebecca, Dana, and Ashwin, for sharing your time and thoughts. This is a very, very important set of discussions, and I hope to have the opportunity to keep meeting you all and learning from you. And I would also like to thank Carrie King and Vivek Shastri, who were very instrumental in putting this together. So with that, I would like to close this session, and thank you again for joining.
Thank you very much.